Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Romans. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's a few things we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, Paul, which is a huge part of the book of Romans. And then we're talking about for why was it written, to to whom it was written, and about what it was written. So the story of the Apostle Paul. So Paul was originally known as Saul. He was a Roman citizen. He was a Pharisee who was supposedly taught by Gamaliel, who was the premier teacher of teachers of the law. So that just from the beginning tells us that Saul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He knew the law in and out, and he was known widely among the Christian community for persecuting Christians. He was there at the stoning of Stephen. Yes, so um, he was known widely in the Christian community. And we see in the book of Acts that on the road to Emmaus, that Saul has a supernatural encounter with Jesus, and through a series of events is radically converted. And that just sets the stage for how he got to being the author of most of the New Testament letters, which is just like a beautiful story of how God will use anyone and can use anyone to um, firstly redeem them, but also use them to share his good news. And now we're going to move on to why Romans was written. So, firstly, Paul's purpose in writing Romans was to prepare the way for his coming to visit in Rome. He speaks of his longing and wanting to be with the Roman church, but is prevented, and so for now he has to write them a letter. And then, secondly, he also presents them with the basic system of salvation. And so, this is known as justification through faith by grace, which is a huge shock to the Jews hearing this because they had been living their lives by law. But we see that the moral law couldn't fix a sinful heart. And so, it's only through the Spirit and our faith in Jesus that we are liberated to love God and love people fully. But this is a shock to them because they've been living their lives by the law and thinking that that is what's going to save them. But it's not their works, it's their faith. So, lastly, he speaks of um, the Jew and Gentile relationship, which he was seeking to explain how they were going to be reconciled all together as one big family in God's plan for redemption, that the Jews and the Gentiles were going to be together, which is another huge shock for the Jews because they've always been God's chosen people. And so for them to hear that it's not just them, but it's also including Gentiles and everyone else is a shock to them as well. And so now we're going to move on to talking about who, which we've already established. It's to the church in Rome, and it's also to the Jew and the Gentile members of the church. So now moving on to talking about what the book is about. There's so much that we could talk about that the book is written over, but just a few main things is that Jesus is the only way to salvation. And we see that in God's plan for salvation. We see the Jew and Gentile reconciliation through Jesus alone. And secondly, we see the topic of justification. And so for Jews, a huge thing is circumcision, and we see that circumcision physically no longer has any meaning or significance, but it's about being spiritually circumcised, about being cut off from things of the world, from sexual immorality, from pagan worship, from um, drunkenness, from anger, from the things that normally wouldn't have been a huge deal to the Jews because they were, as long as they were keeping the law, they were seen as fine. But now it's not about that. It's about the outward, not just about the outward, but it's also about the inward and um, not being outwardly circumcised, but being spiritually circumcised. And then thirdly, we see a huge thing throughout Romans is God's righteous judgment, and we see how no one's without excuse because the things of God are plainly revealed in creation and around people, and the laws of God are written on the hearts of even the Gentiles who don't know God, and so no one's without excuse from God's judgment, His righteous judgment, and His wrath. And so that's just a few things. There are so many important things in Romans that could be talked about. But yes, that brings us to the end of our time together of talking about the book of Romans. Thank you for sticking with me through another presentation. Once again, thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time.